You're standing in a forest. It's 10 million BC. There's no bar. There's no Friday night. There's no group chat asking what everyone's drinking. There's just you, swinging through the canopy, and the smell of something sweet and a little sharp drifting up from the forest floor. Overripe fruit. Fallen fruit. Fruit that started to rot in the best possible way. And somewhere, at some point, one of your ancestors smelled that smell, climbed down, and ate it anyway. This is the story of how humans discovered drinking. Not whiskey, not wine, not the guy at the office happy hour who always orders one more round than everyone else. We're talking about the very first time a living creature in our family tree consumed alcohol and felt something change. And why that might be one of the oldest cravings our lineage has ever carried. Because here's the thing nobody tells you. Drinking doesn't start with humans. It doesn't start with grapes, or grain, or monks in a monastery, or even agriculture. The desire for alcohol might be hardwired into us on a level so deep it predates our entire species. It might predate us being human at all. And the evidence for this is genuinely wild. Let's start with fruit, because before you can drink alcohol, something has to make it, and nature has been making it for longer than we've existed. When fruit ripens past its peak, wild yeast lands on it and starts breaking down the sugar. That process produces carbon dioxide and ethanol. It's not a human invention. It's a byproduct of rot, and it's been happening in forests for tens of millions of years, completely without our help. Now, somewhere in the Miocene, roughly 10 million years ago, something happened in the genome of our ancestors that should not be a casual fact, but absolutely is. A single mutation appeared in a gene called ADH4. That gene codes for an enzyme that's the first thing in your body to encounter alcohol when you drink. Before the mutation, that enzyme was almost useless at processing ethanol. After it, the enzyme became roughly 40 times more efficient. One letter changed in our DNA, and suddenly our ancestors could actually metabolize alcohol instead of being poisoned by it. This mutation shows up in the shared ancestor of humans, chimpanzees, and gorillas. Which means before any of us were separate species, before there was a human lineage at all, something that would eventually become you was already biologically built to handle booze. Researchers call this the drunken monkey hypothesis, and the basic idea is that our tree-dwelling ancestors started coming down to the ground more often, where fallen fruit collects and ferments. The ones who could safely eat that fermented fruit got access to extra calories nobody else could touch. Ethanol has nearly twice the calories of plain sugar by weight. In a world where finding enough food was a daily, life-or-death project, that was a real advantage. In other words, some of our ancestors weren't drinking to get drunk. They were drinking to survive, and getting a little buzzed was just the price of admission. Their brain wasn't confused by the alcohol. It was built for it. And the receptors and reward pathways alcohol lights up in your brain right now, the warmth, the loosening, the little lift. That response is sitting on top of a system that has been rewarding this exact molecule for 10 million years. Think about that for a second. The entire multi-billion-dollar global alcohol industry, every brewery, every vineyard, every distillery, every toast at every wedding, all of it may trace back to a single genetic typo in a fruit-eating primate that just wanted more calories before winter. History is sometimes beautiful in the most absurd ways. Now here's where we have to be careful about timelines, because our ancestors tolerating alcohol and our ancestors intentionally making it are two very different claims. Let's talk about what the archaeology actually tells us. The oldest confirmed evidence of deliberate alcohol production by humans comes from Rakafet Cave, a burial site in the Carmel Mountains near Haifa, Israel. Archaeologists found stone mortars there containing residue from a beer made of wheat and barley, dated to between roughly 11,700 and 13,700 years ago. This wasn't an accident. The starch granules showed the specific distortions caused by malting, mashing, and fermentation at controlled temperatures, meaning someone understood the process well enough to repeat it. And this wasn't a kitchen. It was a grave site used by the Natufians for ritual feasting, a semi-nomadic hunter-gatherer people who hadn't even invented farming yet. That last detail should stop you for a second. These people were making beer before they were growing crops on purpose. Some archaeologists now believe the desire to brew beer may have been one of the original motivations for humans to start cultivating cereal grain in the first place. Not bread, beer. The pursuit of a buzz may have helped invent agriculture, which means it may have helped invent civilization as we know it. If that's true, you can thank a hangover for the modern world. But here's the question that should be sitting in the back of your mind. Does the absence of older physical evidence mean people weren't drinking before 13,000 years ago? Or does it just mean we haven't found it yet? Because alcohol residue is fragile. It survives in a stone mortar in a dry cave under very specific conditions. A leather skin of fermented mare's milk, a wooden bowl of honey wine, a gourd of fermented palm sap. All of that rots and vanishes within decades, long before any archaeologist shows up with a brush and a notebook. So the absence of evidence here is absolutely not the evidence of absence. There's also a deeper, stranger possibility. If our drive to seek out alcohol goes back 10 million years, to a time before we were even using tools, then the real question isn't, when did humans start drinking? It's when did drinking stop being an accident of foraging and start being something we did on purpose, in groups, as a ritual? And that line is much blurrier than people assume. Let's talk about wine, because it's one of the oldest deliberate ferments we have direct evidence for. The earliest known winemaking comes from the Republic of Georgia in the South Caucasus, where archaeologists found grape residue and tartaric acid inside clay jars dating back roughly 8,000 years. These weren't crude containers. They were purpose-built vessels, buried in the ground to keep the wine at a stable temperature during fermentation, essentially the world's first wine cellars. The people making this wine had already figured out something modern winemakers still rely on. Temperature control changes everything. Around the same era, in ancient China, residue analysis on pottery from the Jiahu site shows people were fermenting rice, honey, and hawthorn fruit into a mixed alcoholic beverage roughly 9,000 years ago. Different continent, different ingredients, same basic discovery happening independently. Humans in completely unconnected parts of the world were arriving at fermentation again and again because the underlying biology pulling them toward it was the same everywhere. Now let's go back even further into the uncomfortable territory, because there's a piece of this story most people have never heard, and it touches on whether the drive to get intoxicated is even uniquely human at all. This is where we get to the intoxication hypothesis. Ronald Siegel, a psychopharmacologist at UCLA, proposed in the 1980s that the pursuit of intoxication is a fourth drive, sitting right alongside hunger, thirst, and sex, biologically embedded across the animal kingdom, not just in humans. Elephants in southern Africa deliberately seek out and eat fermented marula fruit, and have been observed behaving erratically afterward. Wild chimpanzees in Bossou, Guinea, have been filmed for nearly 2 decades using chewed leaves as makeshift sponges to soak up naturally fermenting palm sap, drinking it repeatedly, sometimes enough to visibly stumble. Slow lorises and tree shrews in Malaysia regularly lick fermented nectar straight from palm flowers, getting a steady low dose of alcohol as part of their normal diet. None of these animals invented brewing. They just learned, generation after generation, which smell led to the good stuff. The point is, if the drive to seek out alcohol is this deep, this old, and this widespread across completely unrelated species, then it's entirely reasonable to think that long before humans had pottery, long before anyone planted a single grapevine on purpose, our ancestors were already drawn to fermenting fruit the same way a chimpanzee in Guinea is drawn to fermenting palm sap today. This is trial and error stretched across millions of years. Mostly harmless. Occasionally, a primate falling out of a tree. But the behavior survived because, on balance, it paid off. Let's also talk about something that rarely comes up in this conversation. Drinking is medicine. Long before alcohol was recreational, long before it was ritual, it may have been one of the only reliable medical tools our ancestors had. Beer and wine, unlike most ancient water sources, were far less likely to carry waterborne disease because the fermentation process and the alcohol itself killed off many of the pathogens that made untreated water dangerous. In a world without sanitation, that's not a small detail. That might have been one of the single biggest survival advantages a community could have. Ancient Egyptian medical texts prescribe beer as a carrier for medicine, mixed with herbs and used to treat everything from digestive issues to wounds. The ancient Sumerians, who left us some of the oldest written records in human history, documented beer not as a luxury, but as a basic part of daily rations, given to laborers building monuments because it provided safe hydration and real caloric energy. Beer, in this context, wasn't a treat. It was infrastructure. It was payroll. It kept entire workforces alive and functioning. There's another angle to this story that doesn't get enough attention, and it has to do with social bonding. Humans are deeply social animals. We evolved in groups, and group cohesion, the ability to trust the people around you and act in coordination, was a matter of life and death for most of our evolutionary history. Isolated individuals died. Groups survived. Anything that strengthened the bonds inside a group had real survival value. Shared drinking is an extraordinarily effective tool for exactly that. When a group of people drink together, their inhibitions drop in a controlled, predictable, socially understood way. Honest conversations happen. Conflicts get aired instead of buried. Alliances get sealed. Modern research on group behavior has confirmed what ancient cultures already seemed to know instinctively, that shared rituals involving mild intoxication increase trust, deepen group identity, and create bonds that are hard to build any other way. The toast isn't just a nice gesture. It's an ancient piece of social technology. Raising a cup together and drinking from the same source was, and still is, a small ceremony of trust. The Greeks built an entire institution around this. The symposium was a formal, structured drinking gathering where wine, heavily diluted with water by Greek standards, accompanied philosophy, music, and political debate. Drinking unmixed wine, by their own customs, was considered something only barbarians did. The point of the symposium wasn't to get destroyed. It was to loosen the room just enough to talk honestly. Dionysus, the god of wine, wasn't worshipped as a god of mindless excess. He was a god of transformation, of breaking down the rigid social self just enough to access something more honest underneath. Here's where we arrive at the uncomfortable part of the story. The transition from ritual to mass commercial product follows a pattern that should feel familiar by now. For most of human history, alcohol production was slow, small-scale, and deeply tied to community, religion, and seasonal cycles. Brewing was largely a household task. Wine was made once a year and rationed. Distillation, the process of concentrating alcohol into spirits far stronger than anything fermentation alone can produce, didn't become widespread in Europe until roughly the late medieval period. That single technological shift changed everything. Once you can distill, you can take a drink that's naturally capped at around 15% alcohol and turn it into something pushing 40% or higher. The body that evolved over 10 million years to handle dilute alcohol in fruit was suddenly facing concentrations nature never produced. By the 1700s, the gin craze in London was causing public health and social crises severe enough that the British government passed multiple acts specifically trying to control it. By the 1800s and 1900s, industrial-scale brewing and distilling had turned alcohol into one of the most aggressively marketed consumer products on Earth. And like the story of so many other substances humans have a deep relationship with, the alcohol industry in the 20th century learned to study its most vulnerable customers very closely. Internal industry research on advertising effectiveness, drinking patterns, and brand loyalty among young and heavy drinkers has come to light in lawsuits and investigations over the decades. Marketing leaned hard into the same psychology that drives the social bonding instinct we just talked about, selling alcohol as the key to belonging, to confidence, to being the version of yourself you wish you were at the party. The ritual that once meant trust and ceremony got industrialized into something engineered to maximize repeat consumption. A Natufian brewing beer for a funeral feast 13,000 years ago, and a beverage executive approving an ad campaign aimed at college students share almost nothing except the same molecule. The gap between those two people is one of the larger moral distances in this entire story. Both involve alcohol. Almost nothing else is the same. So when did humans actually start drinking? The honest answer is we don't know exactly, and we probably never will. The direct evidence of deliberate brewing takes us back roughly 13,000 years with real confidence. The biological drive underneath that behavior, the attraction to ethanol itself, almost certainly goes back 10 million years. To a primate ancestor we wouldn't even recognize as related to us. It may be older than tools. It may be older than fire. It may be one of the oldest continuous behaviors in our entire evolutionary lineage. What we do know is this: the behavior is extraordinarily old. It predates agriculture. It may have helped cause agriculture. It predates every civilization you've ever learned about in school. And it was very likely already ancient by the time anyone thought to write a single word down. There's something almost poetic about that. For all the things that separate modern humans from our ancestors, the technology, the medicine, the truly baffling amount of content we consume every day, there's this thin thread of continuity running unbroken through 10 million years of life on Earth. Fermentation. Fruit. The slow chemical magic of yeast turning sugar into something that changes how you feel. Some ancient primate climbed down from a tree to eat fruit that had gone a little too ripe, and it worked out well enough that the habit never really left us. It traveled with us through every continent, into Natufian burial caves, into Egyptian breweries, into Greek symposiums, into Georgian wine jars buried for safekeeping, into modern bars on a Friday night. Next time you raise a glass with someone, you're participating in something far older than the drink in your hand. You're doing what our ancestors, and their ancestors, and creatures that weren't even human yet, have been doing for 10 million years. You're chasing the same warm, ancient signal. So here's a question worth sitting with. If the urge to drink is really 10 million years old, baked into us before we were even human, does that change how you think about your own relationship with alcohol? Let me know what you think in the comments.